It's a sing-along tonight. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Moscow City Council regular meeting for Monday, September 16th, 2019. Catherine, lead us in the pledge.
Sure, please join the staff council for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, the first item on this evening's agenda is the regular agenda. We're going to start out because we didn't have committee meetings this week. We won't have a consent agenda. The approval of the minutes from the September 3rd meeting of the City Council.
So moved. Approval.
Second.
Okay, moved by Art and seconded by Brandy. All those in favor, starting with Catherine.
Aye.
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 Okay.
We tried to spell.
Unanimous. Okay. The next thing on the agenda, number 2, is the staff recognition report. Do you have anything for us today?
No, sir, we do not have staff recognition this evening.
And as far as I'm aware, we have no mayoral appointments this
That would
evening.
be
so we'll
correct.
skip that. And now it's time for the public comment and mayor's response period. If anybody wants to talk about anything that's not before us on the agenda or before the planning and zoning or board of adjustment, you're welcome to come up and tell us what you think for 3 minutes. Nobody, huh? Brandon, you sure? Okay, all right. Okay, then we'll move on to the disbursement report. Since we didn't have committee meetings, we'll have disbursement report on the financial side of things. Would normally have been presented at the Public Works Finance
Thank you, Your
committee
Honor.
meeting.
What we have before you, I'm obviously not the finance director, but playing her part tonight. What you have before you is our disbursement reports for August 2019. The CCSR lays out specifically the different categories. Usually what we do is go over the largest expenditures. Largest, as always, is payroll at $1,726,324. That's the largest continuing expenditure. Sometimes we get into capital projects where construction will sometimes exceed that. That would not be the case here. Of particular interest in professional services, we had the payment to Latah County for the council's assistance with the McConnell Mansion project, $19,750. A lift system for the city shop in the amount of $32,000. S&P Global Ratings, which was the rating for our bond issue, of $16,000. Lena Whitmore Park Pathway Project progress payment at $48,000. Fire Station Number 2 re-roof, partial payment of $25,348. Payroll, as I mentioned, $1,726,324. Then we had some contractual payments, $21,000, you notice, is to Milliman and Company. That was the actuarial work that they did for our self-funding proposal. Aspect Consulting, which is last council meeting, Kyle Steele and Mia Bautista talked about Aspect doing our consulting work for our stormwater study. Whitcomb 911, our quarterly payment of $140,428. That brings us to approvals. I'll be happy to answer any questions that I'm able to.
Anybody else have any questions? I didn't personally see any numbers that look out of line there. No extra zeros on things. Good. So I'd entertain a motion to approve the disbursement report for August.
So moved.
I'll second it.
Okay, Catherine moved and seconded by Art. Start with Ann.
Aye.
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 Okay, motion carries. We'll pass that around for signatures.
So it has to be signed by members of the Public Works Finance Committee.
How convenient, we're all right next to each other.
It is. very ceremonial this way.
You want this, Lori? There's the fancy pen, too. Okay, moving along, item number 6 on today's agenda is the Palouse Regional Housing Study Report. Gina Truccio's not here, but I see Brian Points is, so I assume he's going to do the presentation on the housing study.
Yes, I have some introductory comments. As indicated, Gina is ill tonight and unable to attend. You'll recall that a little over a year ago, or right at a year ago, Gina, who is the executive director of the Partnership for Economic Prosperity, came forward with a proposal to conduct a regional housing assessment and study. At that time, there was buy-in from the city of Pullman, universities, Schweitzer Engineering, and the city of Moscow to finance that study. So that study has been conducted over the past several months. Numerous community meetings were held, stakeholders were interviewed, a steering committee was formed which looked at the data that went into the study. So with that, I have a few comments that, since Gina is much more eloquent than I am, will read the foreword from the study itself. Housing plays a pivotal role in determining the well-being and economic security of individuals and families in the Palouse region. For that reason, it is fitting that discussions of housing challenges should have primacy over many matters discussed in the public square. Our housing policies and strategies must also recognize the diversity of conditions existing within and across the region. As such, our local governments, institutions, and businesses have a central role to play in defining specific community needs, crafting policies, and marshaling resources to support housing solutions. Addressing the scale and complexity of need requires a renewed regional commitment to expand the range of housing options available for an increasingly diverse population. Furthermore, since we, the residents of Whitman and Latah counties, walk, talk, and act like a region, it's crucial to approach housing in the same way. The Palouse's shared workforce, economy, and infrastructure needs make it essential that we view housing as a regional imperative. As I indicated, the stakeholders, there are presentations being made to each of the funding and entities as well as to other stakeholders. It's anticipated that a week from tomorrow night, the same presentation will be given to the city of Pullman, one of the other major funders for this study. The study itself will not be passed out tonight, as since there's a little bit of splash to be made with distributing it, to the city council. It will not be distributed, I'm having a tough time with that word, distributed to the city of Pullman next Tuesday night. Either that will be distributed at a little later time. Gina indicates there is an intent to also give presentations to Whitman and Latah counties and other stakeholders. So with that, PEP retained the services of Thomas P. Miller and Associates. Principal in that firm, Brian Points, did the dispositive work on the study. He'll be here to talk about that, give an executive presentation, and we will wait with excitement for the publishing of the whole study. So, Brian Points, thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Do you all have the presentation?
Yes, it was distributed.
Yeah, we have that in our packet.
Okay.
Can you explain how to advance that? Okay, just forward,
Think so.
back.
All right, perfect.
That's all right. Yes, it is.
All right, thanks again, Gary. Thanks, City Council, for having me tonight. And thanks for your support in helping figure this out. It was probably December, January, something like that, last time I was up here with Gina and Paul Kimmel explaining what we wanted to do. And here we are again, hopefully having answered the questions we talked about. So as indicated in the introduction, housing is an issue that a lot of communities grapple with. It's not an issue that can strictly be pinned to an infrastructure issue or a community development issue or an economic development issue. It's simultaneously all of those things. Thomas P. Miller's Associates is a company that focuses frequently on economic development. I can say from our experience in these past 3 to 5 years that people talking about housing as an issue for community growth, for communities to be able to attract workers, retain workers, for the businesses to grow, it's just erupted. Everybody across the country is talking about this, and with that has come some interesting solutions. Now, because everybody is struggling with this issue, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has answers to the issue, all right? Actually, most places aren't doing very much. So to be normal, all you have to do is not very much. And then you can just continue to complain about the challenges you're having. To come up with solutions, you need to be a bit creative, you need to look outside of the box a little bit, you need to perhaps stretch a little bit to come up with some solutions. And so with the recommendations that we've come up with, I want you all to be aware of that these are things that we know in some cases that these would be tough to implement. We don't necessarily expect all of the things to be implemented. I don't think we'd be doing much of a service to the community if we just said, good job, nothing needs to be changed. So instead, we looked at where are all of these gaps, then we try to find some communities that struggled with those same gaps and give you the options for what they did to resolve it. Also, a quick clarification and caveat. This is not a study about affordable housing, quote unquote. Where you put that adjective in association with the noun makes a big difference. Okay, so it's not just about affordable housing. This is about housing that is affordable. Or, as we oftentimes use in the report, the term is attainable housing, because affordable means different things for different levels of people. And our objective here was to look at all types of housing across the board, not just affordable housing. Lastly, one of the things, I'm not sure this got printed. Do you guys have an appendix that says like a legal clarification? Okay, good. So that was one of through the steering committee's recommendations, after seeing our recommendations, there was a request to say, hey, can you take a closer look at some of these things? Because some of them may or may not be attainable or doable given the Idaho state constitution or given, legal requirements and things like that. So we did our best to provide that. Now, I do want to say we are not legal experts. We are not lawyers. This is our understanding of each of those different policies and topics. So what we've tried to do is say, walk through each of those particular cases and say, this seems to be, looking through kind of these murky legal definitions. These seem to be some of the hurdles, some of the stipulations, some of the things you're going to have to deal with. Now, in some cases, our individual recommendations had a piece of something that we discovered, that would probably be really hard, but at the same time, it had a piece of something that is very doable. So, to use an example, it's probably very hard for the city to abate taxes for somebody who's building housing, but it wouldn't be illegal in any way to reduce the permit fees, right? There's nothing in the law saying you can't do that. Whether you want to do that or not, that's another issue, but we're saying that you could do it. All right, so I think that's enough for kind of introductory stuff. And as Gary mentioned, this soon will be available to the public. It's important to us, important to everybody that it does become publicly available. Our only reason for holding it back at this point is we want to be courteous to all of our funders, make sure we present to them first before it goes to the general public. Okay, with that, our areas of expertise, Thomas P. Miller and Associates, these are the things that we're about. Research is at the heart of it, but what we really care about is community issues and how do we help regions resolve that. Just don't want to muddy the waters, but do want to just not confuse anybody further down the road, I suppose. This is my last week working for Thomas P. Miller and Associates. I'm going to be starting my own consulting organization next week. One of the reasons that I stayed as long as I did is because I wanted to make sure this project gets done. So, but this particular project, however long it takes, whatever it takes, TPMA and I are together in it. So, just want to be clear about that. Okay, so the project objectives and project approach. This is the same dialogue, same information that we provided when we started this, 6 to 9 months ago, and we're presenting it again. And as you review that, I have a few other comments on this. So, part of our scope of work here was to understand the what. What type of housing do we have? What type of housing do we not have? what populations and demographics are affected by, what kind of shortages do we have, and how are those, the population cohorts affected by those shortages? So those are the kind of what questions which were important. But I think a lot of you, I remember some of you on city council in particular, really had the question of why? You know, what do we, so you tell us what, and then what are we gonna do about it? So we really did dig deep on that and try to find, we probably have 20 different case studies within the report of places that have done something about issues that are, you know, common to the Palouse region. So the why is super important to us. I mentioned this a little bit before, but again, to touch on it, recommendations by consulting companies are things that are, this is a guide, this is something that seems to make sense, but it's important to keep in mind that this is a report for 2 different counties with who knows how many different cities in it, right? Not all of the same things are gonna work in the same places. You know, it's more of an implementation practice or a study if you're expecting a company to say, take us from here to there. And that's not what we're asked to do. We're asked to provide you some good guidance on how issues like this could be resolved. It's also important to note that it's not strictly about what cities can do. There's a lot of things, frankly, that the city of Moscow is doing really well on this topic. There's some other things that can be improved. But our recommendations, our entire report is about galvanizing and activating an interest in this within the community. Some of the things that we're saying would require partnership between the public and private sectors, or require, say, a credit union or a foundation to provide some seed funding to get something started, right? So it's not all on the heads of the city to make this thing happen. Okay, so yeah, it's gonna be a bit of a stretch, it's a bit of a push. If all of these things were implemented, you know, you'd probably be top 5% in the United States among communities that are doing something about housing, right? So that's, you know, we're trying to show you how do you get from average to something that's above average. Yeah, I think that we've said enough on that issue. So project tasks, here are some of the things that we did throughout the study. A lot of research, we looked at both supply and demand, stakeholder engagement. So it was very important for us to interact with the community. In this case, how we did that was through 4 focus groups, which were hosted in Moscow, Pullman, Troy, and Colfax over the summer. We talked with 18 community leaders. A lot of those folks are actually real estate developers and builders, for whom it was really nice to hear their perspective on the issue. And we've got a little bit of data before we get into some of the recommendations. So, and I know a lot of this stuff, it's like, oh, that's a lot of numbers to look at. I can't possibly understand that in the half a minute that you're going to spend on this slide. I know, that's why the report is coming out. So what you're seeing here basically is a demonstration of cost-burdened populations, and we break it out by different income levels and whether somebody's a renter or an owner, okay? So the federal government, Housing and Urban Development, says that anybody who uses 30% or more of their household income to pay for housing is what they would call cost burdened. So that's a good kind of common benchmark for figuring out where are you compared to the national average. So 38% of our region is what they would consider cost burdened, 31% is the national average, 28% is the average for Idaho, 32% is the average for Washington. So we're above average. Now you may say, well, yeah, but we've got a lot of college students. Okay, good point. That's not something we can particularly isolate by looking at the data. They don't tell you who's a college student, who's not. But instead what we can do is kind of take a backdoor and cut around it by looking at affordability by income level or by where people live. So we have a couple more stats here to show that, like, hey, this is not just an issue of college students, because most college students are not earning between $50,000 and $75,000 per year. Some, but most of them are not. More and more renters. So we've had booms in multifamily development in both Moscow and Pullman over these past probably 10 years, and that's had a major effect on what our community looks like. So to look at that particular issue, we look at what we call householders, so heads of household since 2007. And look at the 2 bars there, the kind of peach one that's actually, unfortunately, it'll washed out on that screen, and then the light brown one. So if you look at those over time, the peach one is growing, the light brown one is basically not growing. And what that is showing is that over that period of time, we've had a 7% increase in adults who own homes, and we've had a 46% increase in adults who rent homes. That's a sevenfold difference. That's a huge difference. You know, a lot of that is driven by the supply that is available, all right? You're faced with, I mean, you're given, I can live in this apartment, or I could not live here, basically, for a lot of folks, because the affordability is not there for buying a single-family home. So we can't, it's very difficult to say exactly what people would do, you know, if, let's say, instead of building, 500 multifamily units over X number of years, he built 500 single-family units. What would people have done? Would they have been more happy in that situation than this situation? That's a difficult question to answer, but what some of the research and the surveys that we've looked into indicates is that if you look at millennials in particular, so this is a bit of a assumption I think that people will sometimes make. It's like, well, millennials like living in apartments. You know, they make that life choice. Well, if you look at the data and the people who have asked them what they would actually like, all else being equal, say, given that they could afford it, they don't really want to live in apartments. It's just that a lot of times they can't afford to live in single-family homes. And part of the reason they can't afford to live in single-family homes is stuff that's completely out of any of our control, which has to do with their debt levels and student loans and things like that. Other pieces of that we have some control over, because in a lot of cases, if you can make homes smaller or if you can make them more dense, that's going to bring the cost down, which is going to make them more affordable for people. Okay, defining the issues. So we broke this into 4 different components: construction, economic, community, and government and regulatory. And these are not value statements. They were just observations about things that we found to be true. And as you read through them, I'll highlight a couple of things. Construction is hard. It's especially hard here. So costs have risen like crazy everywhere, and they're more expensive here because of our topography, because of our soil, because of our distance from major metro areas. That's a hard thing for us to overcome, and there's not really an easy solution for it unless we suddenly get a lot bigger and have a lot more suppliers, which we're not necessarily recommending. The student population requires special consideration. It does bring a lot of benefits, but at the same time, many community members desire some level of separation between kind of the student areas and the residential areas. And so some of our recommendations have to do with utilizing overlay zoning and perhaps creating more incentive and encouragement for students to live in a certain area so that you can do other more creative things in the other residential areas that may encourage more density without attracting more students at the same time. Our economy is strong, but it's not as strong as some other areas, so builders are building in other places. We're also not particularly diverse. You know, we're primarily driven by government and manufacturing in this area, and a lot of developers are looking for more diversity of your economic sectors to make investments there. We're surrounded by a lot of farms. There's a lot of agricultural use, and that agricultural use is incredibly productive and profitable. And part of the reason for that is because of the land, therefore that makes the land expensive. Again, that's a kind of a tough thing to undo. What we do think you might be able to do with that is perhaps as the community rallies around this concept if you look at, say, the transfer of wealth. So from one generation to the next, especially with the baby boomers retiring, there are a lot of assets, a lot of land, a lot of wealth that's tied up in those generations. And sometimes they don't know what to do with it. What they need is a strong community vision, something they feel strongly about investing in. If they see good leadership there, they see a good concept, they see some good pictures, they may think, I could give my land to that concept, or I could sell my land for cheaper than I otherwise would to give to that concept. So there are ways to deal with that as well. For some out-of-town builders, the area doesn't have a great reputation. It's been told to me it's kind of a hard place to do business. So I'm not differentiating there between Moscow or Pullman. I think mostly because those builders don't differentiate either. So I don't know whether that's true, but I do know that if we want, as a region, to see more housing, if we want to see developers come from out of town to build more housing, we're going to have to overcome that in some way, which is going to require some proactive engagement. housing gap, oh, excuse me, that's the next slide. So here's some of our key recommendations. And again, I'm not going to go into detail on every one of these slides. It'll be in the report. Our first recommendation is develop a Palouse housing leadership team. Very important. It's a multidisciplinary issue. We need people that have understanding of construction, of real estate development, of planning and zoning, of city code, of legal issues. We need a team, and we need a team that isn't particularly concerned whether it's built in Moscow or Pullman or frankly Colfax or Troy. We need people who care about the region, who are able to address a lot of these issues, because a lot of things that we've come up with are going to require a bit more research to figure out if is this going to work? How do we shape this to make this work within our region? And that's going to be their job. Some of the other things, as you read through them here, a lot of the ones in the middle there, from priority land set-asides to the rural housing transition zones. Again, this is about, we've looked elsewhere, and we said, here's some things that people are doing. One example of that would be the Regional Coalition for Housing, which exists in King County, Washington. So that's a collaborative structure of 15 cities in King County. Their objective is to develop more affordable housing. Through that partnership, so you've got the public sector side, but they also have partnered with some financial organizations to help them with that seed funding. So if you actually look at how they fund things, it's a combination of city funds, federal tax credits, and what they call the Arch Housing Trust Fund. So they built this pool of money to start with so they could have something to do some projects with. Maybe that works in Moscow. Maybe there's a different structure that works. That's one that seems to work pretty well. Grants. So I can't tell you exactly you're going to win grants, but I'll tell you the same thing that I did when I came here a couple of months ago, which is when I do see organizations get money from the federal government or from a foundation, it's because they have good leadership in place and they have a plan. So I would say with this plan, with what you've invested in understanding this issue, and once you get this leadership team set up, I don't see why go after some grants, go after some funding, start writing proposals, and you should get some funding, because that's usually the way these things go. Clarity, increased clarity in development standards. So again, the City of Moscow has done a pretty good job on this already, improving some of the things that used to be there. So now you can actually go to a place in the city code, city ordinances, where it says, here's what is allowed in each of these residential districts. Okay, very helpful. We could see more there, though. Some of the examples you see, some of them we put in the report, very visual, nice pictures, right? If you poll the average person in Moscow, they probably couldn't tell you what the acronym FAR means, floor area ratio, in case anybody doesn't know. But that's the kind of thing that people need to be told. These are the landowners, these are the people who live here. If they're going to be the ones that are going to do something, right, if they're going to use their existing land to develop, they need to know how it works and they need to be educated about it. So there's some communities doing some good work on that front. Skilled labor, honestly, it's not a quick, easy solution on that at all. One of the recommendations that we brought up is something that's happened in various places in Idaho, which is the construction combine. Okay, that may help you get 2 or 3 more people aligned into the construction industry that wouldn't be there previously. But it's a long-term play, and it's one that potentially the universities and colleges could be involved in as well. So there's some thoughts on recommendations. On the housing gap itself, we were asked to kind of quantify where are we at and what are we missing. So we're saying that over the next 10 years, we believe that the community, the population, the growth would support this, over 3,200 total units, of which the vast majority would be single family, so 2,600. So that'd be an average production of 270 single family units per year. That would basically double the single family housing production that we've seen on the Palouse in the past 10 years. And we're not really splitting out, as again, this is a regional issue. We're not saying that should be in Moscow or it should be in Pullman or it should be somewhere else, because most people in the region will live wherever makes most sense to them, as long as they can get to their jobs. This is a bit of a stretch, right? This is a bit hard. There may have been some years in the past, say 10 to 20 years, where we've hit this level. Housing production just before the recession was pretty high in both Moscow and Pullman. Moscow has held up decently past couple of years. Whitman County is at basically an all-time or at least a 10-year low in terms of housing production. So we're going from going from a place where we're not nearly producing enough to we're producing what the community needs. And in order to do that, we recommend that you all look at the recommendations and also look at the types of housing that we're recommending to be either encouraged or facilitated in some way. With this, we're also not saying that we don't need any multifamily, but we're saying that it would be a good thing for the community if we could kind of flip that ratio of production from 50 to 60% multifamily production, probably closer to 60%, to 60% single family. Okay. Recommendations and best practices. This is to give you an indicator of where to find this within the report. I think it's going to be page 8 or page 9. We wanted to make it really clear, aligned with those issues, what are the recommendations, where can you find the best practices, and what is the group that's primarily responsible for doing something about it. So nothing new to show you here other than I just wanted to point out that that's an important place to look in the report. It'll be a helpful kind of index for everybody. Recommended housing types. So some of these things are things that already exist or are already doable in the community. Other things would be new concepts, introductions that you see elsewhere, but you don't see so much here. When we looked across the landscape of the region, what we saw is that it's one of two things. It's either apartments or it's a large home, a 2,600 square foot home that's probably over $300,000-$400,000. That doesn't leave a lot in that middle space where people actually have the money to pay for a home. So some of the things that we recommend are small single-family homes. So these are single-family detached, smaller lots. So these are not tiny homes. These are somewhere in like that 500 to 1,200 square foot range. Usually you're going to see them in either an R1 or an R2 district. Currently, to do something like this would require a planned unit development process. Maybe you keep it that way. Maybe you adjust things so it's easier for people to do that by right without having to get as many permissions and modifications with planning and zoning. You could also say keep it, it's close to the density standards of like a small single-family home cottage neighborhood would fit decently within an R3 or an R3 or an R4 zone, so you could take that route as well. Agri-hoods. So for probably the past 100 years, we've been going in this direction of separating agriculture from residential. It's just the way that culture has led us. This is more of a concept about reintegrating those things back together, especially makes sense in communities like ours that are very heavily agricultural. So you can look to the recommendations in the report. There's developers across the country that are doing this. So kind of think analogous concept would be a golf course, right, which is in the middle, and then you got a bunch of houses around the outside. So this would be more like putting a farm of some sort, which could be a community farm, it could be a community garden, it could be an orchard, it could be a commercial wheat production. It could be a lot of different things. So that would require some collaboration between landowners and real estate developers. Tiny homes, don't freak out. We're not talking about the ones on wheels, we're talking about that's the first key differentiation. A lot of the kind of jazzy stuff that you see on TV is people who are living in tiny homes that they drive around the country and set down wherever they want. We recognize there's a lot to be concerned about there, and that's not something, we don't think that that's either a good thing or a bad thing. It's just not a particularly important topic. But what you can do is look at tiny homes that are on foundations. That's a way that you can wrangle them. You can actually figure out how do we regulate this and zone it. And there's a lot of communities that have done a good job with that. If you make them small, again, these are like less than 500 square feet, you can make them really cheap. That's probably the cheapest form of housing that you can make. Another concept, and this has been used in a few other places across the United States, is perhaps just look at mobile home parks as a place to permit these, right? And that zoning is going to be different from place to place, but a lot of mobile home park owners are really kind of struggling with their outdated housing concept, their outdated housing, which they know isn't going to last forever, and they would like to put something else there, but they can't currently. I mean, they could put a tiny home on it, but they couldn't fit them in the same density that they would need to make that productive and profitable for them. So that's a concept to consider. Accessory dwelling units are permitted in both Moscow and Pullman, but because of the minimum square footage requirements, they can be difficult to pull off, and people don't tend to do them. So if you look at places like Portland and Vancouver, British Columbia, and a few other places, they just dropped the minimum square footage requirements from, say, 5,000 to 4,000 or 3,000. And that change can be enough to encourage a lot of people to make that adjustment. Another thing you could look at there is adjusting the parking requirements and some of the other things that may deter people from using that model. Modular built. So this is not so much a type of housing as it is like a housing production methodology, because modular can be used to anywhere from like tiny homes all the way up to deluxe, large single-family homes. And what we particularly like about the concept is that one of the struggles that builders have locally is a lack of workforce who knows how to do this kind of thing. So with modular building, so let's say you find a contractor who's in Beaverton or Salem or something like that, right? They've got a factory, they've got people who are in there who can do that job, and it's not actually as much of a craftsmanship job when it's put into a factory setting. So they can produce those units predictably and faster, and without accounting for weather issues and stuff like that. So it solves a lot of issues. It might be more affordable. It's not necessarily more affordable. It kind of depends on the situation and which contractor you're using, but it does help with that lack of labor issue. Okay, so that's the very 30,000 square foot level. Next steps is to form this Palouse Housing Leadership Team that we discussed. With that, it's going to require, that team is going to have to do some homework, do some footwork, and part of that is going to be take these ideas and lay them out on a table and say, what are we going to do first? Who's going to do what seems most feasible? What kind of issues are we going to run into? Who's going to go up to Spokane and go talk to these single-family home developers that we want to recruit back to our area, that kind of thing. We do strongly recommend there is a dotted line with the city government organizations, city and county government organizations. This could be a nonprofit kind of organization, but they need to be collaborating and working with planning and zoning and public works if it's going to work at all. That's just something obvious. But and then what else they do beyond that is to be determined. We're very near the point now with a few of the last elements that I and my team need to hone in the report, and then it's turning the reins over, and it becomes the property of these communities to do with it as they wish. So, and that is it, and I'll take questions from any of you. Yes, Catherine.
I was just curious, I have a lot of questions, and this is a beginning for sure. So that's good. But how many total people were there in the surveys from Troy, Colfax, Pullman, Moscow?
Yeah. So the focus groups, I'd have to look that up. I know we have it written down in the report, but if I had to guess, I'd say there's probably 40 to 50 people between those four different events that came. Interestingly, the Colfax one was the most highly attended. So we got some really good feedback there.
And then I was just curious, when you said you wanted to make sure the stakeholders, so it sounded like you talked about stakeholders in two ways. Stakeholders as the people that came to the meetings, and then the people that funded. So who, can you divide them out?
Yeah. So I'd say it's a pretty loose term. It's probably one that we as consultants use a little too often. But I would say there's funders, which are organizations like the City of Moscow and University of Idaho, and then there's stakeholders who may or may not have put money into it, but like the real estate developers and builders are part of the stakeholders because they have a claim in what this means and they're able to do something about it, right? So that'd be kind of the narrow definition of a stakeholder. But in one sense, you could say the entire community is a stakeholder because they all have something to do with it.
But they didn't necessarily all participate because of
Right. Yeah.
numbers and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't do a survey, right? That, it would have been much more time consuming and expensive if we tried to touch everybody in
Yeah.
the region. So, yeah, we
And-
tried to
and-
take a sampling.
I have another question. So you had a quote that you said that 60% single family was the recommendation kind of coming out of this. You said you'd like to see that flip. And I was wondering if, because family units are not necessarily defined as always father, mother, children. Sometimes it's multi-generational. When you make that recommendation, is that what you're saying?
Well, so what, I think I have a lot to say on that. So, let me just start talking and hopefully it
Okay.
turns out right. The way the census talks about these things is households, which doesn't mean mom, dad, kids. It just means people who are living together, right? So that's, in one sense, that's what we're talking about because that's the majority of the data that we used. Now, the fact that households and family compositions have changed pretty dramatically in the past 60 years is actually a very big part of the reason why we need to reconsider our housing development practices, because a large single-family home is not suited for a lot of what the households that now exist, right? Which maybe don't have any children, or maybe they're multi-generational, right? So the pattern of large single-family housing that really flourished between 1900 and 1950, we don't have that same culture now, and we don't need those same type of houses to the same extent that we once did.
I agree with you, and that's why when you made the statement that 60%, we need that flip, it's just that terminology is, maybe you have it explained in the report more.
Right, right.
but-
Well, I mean, I do think that's part of the reason that multifamily has become more popular, but there's no middle ground for a lot of people, and that's part of the problem, because there's still a lot of benefits to owning and living in your own home, right? Getting the equity, getting to, having the freedom of getting to do what you want on your own property, all that kind of stuff. People like that. People still want that. It's just that they may not have enough money to buy that kind of lifestyle. So you're faced with, as I've heard a lot of people say throughout this study, is like, I could buy a trailer for, less than $100,000, or I could buy a new house for over $400,000. Why is there such a big difference here? So that's what we're trying to do, is help find some ways you can get into single-family unit settings in that missing middle area.
So should we use the word household then instead of family unit?
Yeah, I think that'd be fine. Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
just not
and
as
I don't know
defined.
how often I used it, but I probably should have been using the word household in most of those occasions.
Well, that's why I asked for clarification, because, I know that you thought about this in depth, so
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to understand. So you actually mean units for many more people that live in one house, but not necessarily related,
Right, exactly.
okay?
Yep.
Or they could be.
They could be.
Right.
Yep.
I've got one for you. When you were talking with various institutions, financial institutions, landowners / developers, the construction people, were there any threads in there that they indicated would help them see new means of development? For example, the clustered tiny home developments, things like that? Or is it a case where we have to do more education to bring them to the table and let them know that these options exist rather than
Right.
business as usual?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there's a fairly, an above average level of sophistication and understanding in our community in general and in our building community. They're looking around at the rest of the country and they're seeing what models they may want to try. And some of them have tried them, we have things like the Green Acres development here in town, right, which is basically a small single-family home development of exactly the sort that we're recommending. So people are aware of these things. I think there could be more education about it, and I think that when it comes to doing things like changing zoning code, there's a certain process that needs to be followed, and part of that is public engagement. And if the population isn't educated about what those things are, some people may resist it. So I think that public education, probably less so for the builders, but definitely for I think the builders I think both of them need some education. I'll just,
How
leave
about
it
the
at that.
financing guys? Because they're the ones who've
Yeah.
got the purse strings.
Right.
And are still into the 15 and 30-year mortgage period.
Yeah.
And if you don't fit that model, you're out.
Yeah, well, I mean, just like cities do, they have a lot of kind of restrictions that prevent them from perhaps doing some of the things that they may want to do. But they ought to be engaged as well, especially if you can find, as we've done in some places in this report, said, this CDFI invested in this thing. Right? They may not know that that's a potentiality, that that's even doable, right? That it's even legal. So, yeah, I think so. I think education is important for all of those groups.
Question for you. You mentioned the recommendation for incentives. I think this is kind of building off of Art's question, but will there be some more detail about what those incentives could be for developers to say, it sounds like what we need is these small, single-family homes? Will that be in the report, what those incentives can look like?
We have comments on those things, and that appendix breaks that down in a little bit of detail. So what's in the report now, I don't think we're going to take it much further than that, because we've shown, here's some different ways that this has been done. I think from there, it kind of gets into the territory of implementation, and take these ideas and see what you all can figure out and what you want to embrace. Because some types of incentives are probably not what you would want to do, right?
Brian, in terms of developing the leadership team, is that going to be something that's going to be addressed in the final report on how that might be constructed, what you guys saw as maybe the best way to construct that to move forward in a logical fashion?
So I was going to say stakeholders. I'm not going to say it. We talked with the funders about that, and we told them to start thinking about who should be involved. And I know I have a short list of people that I've kind of identified through this process. Like, yeah, they would have something good to add to this process. So I just need to talk to Gina's the project manager on your side, right? I'm the project manager on the consulting side. I need to talk to her about how do we hand those reins off, and then she'll figure out from there, who's going to be involved and how that organization is going to be supported. Yes.
I have another question about the report, just wondering what's going to be in it. Is there information about density? Because that came up quite a bit. And in questions that either you posed to the people that came or the developers, or did people kind of ask questions about density, or how did you?
Yeah, there was a lot of discussion about density, and that's, I think we say somewhere in the report that we recommend that density be increased across the board in every zoning district. I think that would help, and some places have already been doing that. Now, that's not something you want to shove down people's throats. It's public education, it's engagement, it's making sure everybody's on the same page, but it could be done, and it would be helpful. And I'd say with that, when we did like the focus groups and the public engagement, when we showed people actual examples of here's what a cottage neighborhood looks like, or here's what a modular home looks like, there was a lot of interest, and people kind of raising their eyebrows like, oh, I never really realized that was an option. Can we have those here? And it's, well, kind of, sort of, we need to change some things. So there are some places where there's apprehension, but for the most part, I'd say it was excitement at the prospect of bringing in denser housing.
So in the case studies, is that like some of the examples that you
Yep.
have in there
Yep.
that you had shown to the people?
Yep.
Is there going to be anything in there about how transportation dovetails with this? Because as you move out into less expensive land that's farther away, transportation
Right.
becomes a functional issue on how affordable housing is? Is that
Yeah,
part
I
of
mean,
it?
it's naturally part of it. We didn't take a really deep look at it because most of the stuff that we're discussing has to do with urban areas, and then there's a few things that are on kind of the peripheral areas as well. So I think what I would say is that by improving housing unit production within your urban areas, you are already doing a lot to kind of address transportation issues, because if you look at, say, Potlatch, for example, over 50% of the workforce commutes to Moscow or Pullman. It hollows out during the day. And that because people are living there because it's cheaper than living in Moscow or Pullman. And some of them because they like it there, can't discredit that. But that's what a lot of our outlying communities have become, which obviously is a challenge in the winter, and it's an infrastructure issue and all those kinds of things. So that's probably the extent we're going to take it with this. I think there's probably more that needs to be discussed as far as what other strategies for transportation are required.
Just a comment, I have to give a lot of credit to our Planning and Zoning Commission. I'm currently the liaison, and 3 of the things that you have recommended, they have been actively working
Right.
on. Recently removed the minimum lot size for the accessory dwelling units.
Yeah, great.
And are working on some changes to the mobile home zoning to consider things like tiny homes and removing minimum or maximum length of stays that are permitted to address the attainable housing issue. And also, they've been doing a lot of work on exploring cluster developments and just the things that you talked about, increasing
Very good.
density
Yep.
that could result in changes in setback requirements, lot size requirements, and everything. So it's just really great to hear
Yeah.
that they are already very well on their way with many of these things that you're recommending. So
Yeah,
I just
definitely.
want to recognize that their forward-thinking and work they've been doing towards many of these things already, so.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And it was a pleasant surprise for us in a lot of cases because we didn't necessarily know that some of those things were going on until we got, forwarded an email or heard about something. It's like, oh, okay, great, they're already doing it. But not necessarily, again, this is about Whitman County and Latah County in its entirety. Not all of the areas of our region are doing those things.
Anybody else have any questions? Thank you very much, Mr. Points, for your
I do,
presentation.
BJ.
Oh,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I have to say, I think it's odd that we're discussing a report that we haven't seen at full length. I think it makes it hard to talk about the level of detail that this, I think, demands. So my question is, to you and to staff, are we going to have an opportunity as a body to do that? And to have those in-depth conversations once we've seen that report?
Certainly. When PEP finally releases the report after the stakeholders have been presented, then we'll have a chance, if the council wants to take a look at it, ask questions, that sort of thing, certainly.
Okay.
And for my part, I'm happy to come back and in front of the firing squad at that point too.
I just think that it would be nice to be able to have all
Yeah,
the
I understand what
information to
you're
have
saying.
this discussion. Because I think some good questions, but it's really tough to do
Yeah.
at this point.
Yeah, on behalf of PEP, we tried to step it so that all the presentations were made fairly quickly in relation to each other. Just because some folks had meetings that were full up, they weren't holding meetings, it stretched out into something a little longer than we had originally anticipated.
And to clarify, so you're expecting, or the plan is that all of us will be presented this at the same time, or individually as entities we will, and then we'll all be responsible for regrouping for our own conversations, or can you
Yeah.
clarify for me?
Once it's released, then we'll be sending it out electronically and give it to you hard copy if you desire. After that, it's council's discretion if they would like to have another work session on it, if they'd like to talk about it in a separate meeting, that'd be fine too.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, well, I think it's great, we've kind of know where this is going and what to expect and what to look for. But I agree with Ann, we need some numbers and some, detail before we can really discuss it and take any action on it, so.
Okay.
Thanks for the
That makes
report,
sense.
and we're looking forward to the actual numbers and where we might go with them.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Okay, item number 7 on today's agenda is the A Street Phase 2 project approval and funding alternatives. Project's been going on trying to get this done for 30 years, so we're hopeful that this will get it over the top.
Yes, and wish I had better news for the council tonight. The reason that we're in front of you is the A Street project, as you mentioned, has been in the works for many, many years. A Street Phase 1 was constructed in the late 1990s. It connected essentially Peterson Street to Farm Road. That was a field before. And the match for that project, it was federal aid funds at the time, federal grant funding that helped construct that. It was built in 2 phases. Phase 1 was what was done in the late 1990s. Phase 2 is what's at issue today. We knew at that point it was going to have to be 2 phases because some of it the idea was to make A Street a secondary arterial for east-west traffic, knowing that 6th Street was being as it's going through the University of Idaho campus. As a continuous east-west street, it had limited utility. In addition, Highway 8, at the time that the A Street project was moving forward, Highway 8 had yet to be developed to the extent that it is now. It was a 2-lane roadway with 1 turn lane. Now it's a 4-lane. The state of Washington improved Highway 270, which helped access as well. But anybody who's been on 3rd Street or the Pullman Road at rush minute in Moscow, you know that traffic can be backed up almost to Line Street from the Jackson 3rd Street intersection. So A Street has always been on the minds. As I indicated, Phase 1, the match was raised through a local improvement district for properties that were adjacent to those improvements. In addition, there were funds generated, and the city has been saving funds for the match for the second phase of A Street. We have a match of a little over, or right, just a little over 8%, 8.5% or 7.5%, I can't remember the number exactly, but suffice it to say that the match rate is really beneficial to the city. In the late 2000s, or about 2005 actually, we started working on A Street Phase 2. A Street Phase 2 runs essentially from Peterson Street to Home Street. It's a very problematic area of road. Les McDonald, our former Public Works Director, presented to this council several times on A Street. It's problematic because the street is deteriorated. It has some problematic intersections. Parking along A Street is difficult because of the topography. The houses to the north of A Street, north of the right-of-way, there's a sidewalk. In some areas, there's a tree lawn, and then there are typically retaining walls holding back the front yards of the structures or the homes located along there. The intersection of A and Line Street is very problematic. A, Line, and Circle Drive, actually, it's a 4-legged intersection, but is controlled on 3 legs. Traffic yields to the traffic going south on Circle Drive, mainly because of the difficult topography of the area. In the wintertime, it is extremely difficult to stop on Circle Drive. So the Line Street, the A Street traffic traveling east and west stops at a stop sign, and traffic going south on Line, north on Line, turns, has the right-of-way over the legs on North and East A. In addition, there are problems with the topography. The elevation of Line Street comes in very steeply to the A Street, Line Street, Circle Drive intersection. This project will leaven that out, will reduce the elevation. We have obtained rights-of-way from the property owners along the street. We've used federal grant funds to do that. Engineering has been done on the project as well. Circle Drive will turn into a cul-de-sac, as Les reported about 8 months ago to this body. Circle Drive will be cul-de-sac, so that will be cut off. The A and Line intersection will be a T intersection, which will make it much safer, increase northbound traffic off of Line Street with what amounts to a free right turn. In addition, water and sewer utilities under Line Street will also be replaced. This was all well and good. We had council met last November. At that time, we were moving forward with the A Street Phase 2. ITD, through the local Highway Technical Assistance Council, LTAC, indicated that they would have approximately $3.5 million in federal funds to assist in the grant. However, it was spread over 2 budget years. The federal budget year is from July 1st to June 30th, which does not coincide either with our fiscal year, which is October 1, September 30th, nor construction season, which usually starts around April and ends sometime in November. So essentially, it was LTAC's proposal that we would construct A Street over 2 years. So that meant the street would be opened up for 2 years, increased costs because of mobilization, winterizing the construction site, so on and so forth. So At that time, we inquired if it was possible to proceed in the FY19 construction season, which would have been this construction season we're still currently in. ITD indicated yes. In 2018, they thought they could get the project bid if the city, but they would not bid the project until they had sufficient funds in place in order to meet the engineer's estimate. So at that time in November, they essentially said, if the city wants to prepay the federal funds that won't be available till after July of 2019, they could bid the project for construction in 2019. Council said that would be fine. We would utilize some interfund borrowing to be able to do that, and we prepaid $1,264,000, which was the federal grant that would have allowed us to construct A Street Phase 2 in FY 2000, or construction season 2019. Unfortunately, the project was not bid in November or December of 2018, nor January, February, or March of 2019, for several reasons. One was just the bidding structure that ITD was using, some software, some processes had changed, so it wasn't ready to move forward with bidding until late March or early April of 2019. Not exactly the best time to be bidding a construction project that had to be done by mid-November of that year. So April 1st, we came back to City Council and asked City Council, what do you want to do? Do we want to split the years up again, or do we want to bid it now knowing that most contractors have their work ready for the year? Council then said, even though we've told the people in the area it will be a 2019 construction, we would rather delay that, make sure the project gets done correctly, asked LTAC if we could slip that bid until 2020 construction. Sent LTAC that information, they agreed, they said they would then bid the project in July or August of 2019 for a 2020 construction year. With the, I guess, ITD's advice that that's typically when they bid their projects, so they thought that we'd have pretty stable prices at that time. So understand now the lay of the land. ITD has the grant from the federal government for 2019 construction. They are still awaiting the $1,264,000 of federal funding for 2020 construction. But they have our prepayment of $1,264,000 for in anticipation of that federal funding. In addition, they also had $715,000 of what we call non-eligible project improvements, which essentially are underground utilities, water and sewer. Those are not grant eligible, so the federal government does not give us any funding for that, but they are rolled into the project. So LTAC does the engineering, they're the project managers, so on and so forth. And so we sent at that time, and then we also had about $230,000 of the match for the FY 2020 federal funds. So at this time, when ITD went out to bid in July, they had sufficient funding under the engineer's estimate to construct the project in construction season 2020. As we've seen all too often, the bidding climate, the bids went out, they were opened on August 20th, and they were much more than had been anticipated. Included in your packets, copy of some documentation that was sent out by an email from LTAC. And as you can see, the engineer's estimate for the project, not counting the engineering administration, was $3,049,684. The bid actually came in at $3,839,913 for a difference of $790,229. $790,229. So after engineering and administration costs, which is part of the contract that we have with LTAC. I included the contract in your packets. The costs for engineering and administration are about 28.5%. So the numbers that I put in the very verbose memo, I apologize for that, do not match any of the numbers exactly because I took into consideration those engineering and administration costs, which is not hard bid numbers, which the contractors bid. But suffice it to say that the difference that the city needs to come up with if they want the project constructed is $971,758. Of that number, 93,000 of that is increased cost for the non-eligible underground utilities. Should the council advise that they wish to proceed with the project, and I missed a step, LTAC has indicated that if the council wants the project to move forward, then any overage over the engineer's estimate needs to be funded by the city. So 93,000 of non-eligible utility work would be paid through the water and sewer fund in different proportions according to the work being done, leaving about $852,000 that we needed, or excuse me, $875,000 that we needed to come up with if we want the project to proceed on a street level or eligible, grant eligible funding. Kind of a bitter pill to swallow. However, as Jim indicated, A Street is a 30-year project. It has gone in fits and starts. As you know, as we move federal aid funds or federal grant funds around with the assistance of LTAC or ITD, sometimes those funds go to another project for a while, then they come back, your project drops down. But if you ever have a project fully funded according to the engineer's estimate, if you don't proceed with the project, then the chance for funding that project at a later time go away. So they figure that you're not that interested in the project, why should ITD and LTAC be interested in providing that conduit to federal funds? So that $875,000 had not been anticipated. As I indicated, they do have $1,264,000 of city funds down there now. So we've looked at what it would take, what funding we could come up with in order to make that work. We did, according to council's authority, we did invest $1 million of sewer funding in this project. That's why it went down. That funded $1 million of that $1,264,000 number. The sewer fund would be returned 2.5% interest per annum on those funds. So essentially, we need money to pay back to the sewer fund. ITD will take the $875,000 out of the funding that they already have from us. We need to pay back the sewer fund because that was the deal that was made in the resolution that the council passed. So what we've been trying to do is come up with the funding to be able to do that. If you look on page 3 of the memo that I gave you, we have a couple of different, well, let's get to the options first. First option is to tell LTAC and ITD we aren't interested in proceeding with the A Street project. If we do, as I indicated, it drops off LTAC's radar at that point. There's really no place for it to go. It's been engineered. It's ready to move forward. We have purchased right-of-way, and in fact, we have expended funds for the purchase of right-of-way, and LTAC, if we decide to pull out of it, we will have to reimburse LTAC for the engineering that they've already done on the project. Welch Comer Engineers did that under contract to LTAC. So that would be, an estimate is probably somewhere around $500,000, $400,000 to $500,000 that we would have to reimburse LTAC because we essentially expended federal funds on both the right-of-way acquisition and the engineering. So that is not staff's recommendation. Recommendation number 2, or excuse me, option number 2 is that we ask LTAC to rebid the project. That is available to us. We have looked at the bids. There are, as I mentioned in my memo, there are some unit pricing inconsistencies that we need to deal with, but Our engineers have looked at it, Bill has looked at it. It doesn't appear like there is any magic bullet out there that it was bid at the wrong time or anything like that. It's just construction costs have gone up since this project was originally estimated. And we've seen that in some other projects as well. Well 10, the booster stations as an example, the multimodal bridge on this 6th Street or 3rd Street as another example. So construction costs are just at an all-time high. My contemporaries that I talk to in other cities all indicate the same thing. They are essentially piecing funding together out of accumulations that they have for separate projects in order to move any projects ahead at this time. So we could delay it, rebid it. The cost of rebidding won't be hugely expensive, but it'll just delay the inevitable. We don't anticipate that we'll get better prices through that. So that is not staff's recommendation as well. And discussions with LTAC bear this out. Then we get to C option, which is the option that council move forward with asking LTAC to accept the bids and that we find the funding to make up the difference. As an aside, LTAC has given us a little bit of leeway here. They are having a board meeting in October, early October, and the deadline for submitting agenda items is today, but they've given us till tomorrow if the council makes a decision to move forward. LTAC has a policy that if bids come in at 10% or over of an engineer's estimate, that it takes specific board action to award that bid, so it must go before the board. Additionally, again, their rule that they have to have the money in hand before they will let a bid or even bid a project out. They need affirmation from the city of Moscow that we wish to proceed with the project in spite of the overrun. So, because we have identified funding that we believe we can utilize, and I'm prepared to explain that in just a moment, staff's recommendation is that you do authorize us to advise LTAC to move forward with award of the contract for 2020 construction of A Street, and that we indicate to them that the city will accept responsibility for the $875,000 grant-eligible expenses, the street expenses, as well as the additional $93,000 of non-eligible or subsurface utility expenses. As I indicated, the subsurface expenses, we will use accumulations in water capital and sewer capital to do that. So we have funding to do that. We have more capital accumulations in the utilities, of course, because we have long-range projects that we're accumulating money for. That money we will have to adjust as we go, but we're not reallocating money for projects that are going to go for next year, for instance. There is a chance to recoup, accumulate those funds. General fund's a little tougher. General fund and street fund, as you know, two of the most challenged funds when it comes to building up any sort of capital. But we do have some projects that we can move forward. One is, and there are several of these, I'll go through the ones that shouldn't be a huge issue. One is the sidewalk program. The sidewalk program is funded at $200,822. Way more than we had last year, which I believe was around $50,000. There are sidewalk improvements on A Street, so rightfully we could use some of those funds to assist with that. Would leave us with an additional $150,822 in order to do sidewalk projects throughout next year. Again, we'd like to have that extra $50,000, but A Street comes but once in a lifetime, it seems like, certainly once in a generation. Second, pavement management program funds. These are the funds that we utilize to do slurry seals, some street reconstruction, some of the rubberized pavement processes that we've been using have been very successful. Talking to Tyler Palmer and Bill Belknap, looking at next year. We're not looking at any street treatments for next year. There is a street that does need to be rebuilt, Lily Street, which is an ancillary street, a perpendicular street to A Street. It has water and sewer issues, and if you're going to dig up the street for water and sewer, the street itself is in poor shape. It was anticipated that that would proceed, and that's where the bulk of the PMP funding will go next year anyway. So we're looking at $52,816,000 out of a budgeted amount of $800,000 out of that accumulation. Third is partial use of Moser Park street improvement accumulation. Moser Park, we anticipated it's a long park with a curvature to it, a curve on it. The city is responsible for the city's share of 1/2 of improvement of that street. So we've accumulated funding for that. We have a project estimate that has been updated, by the way, in case you think that we haven't done that, about $300,000 to do that. As soon as the developer wants to move forward with the project, we will be able to partner with the developer and get that street installed. We anticipate, because of some different pressures, the developer has indicated that he would not proceed with that project until 2021, likely 2022. We have $300,000 accumulated. We would utilize $100,000 of that accumulation. That allows us 2 years to build that back up at about $50,000 a year. So we would use that as well. The other is the partial refund of the funds we have already paid to ITD. Once the $875,000 is deducted from that for the overrun, or excuse me, the excess of the engineer's estimate, that should bring us back about $388,150. So that is money that we will receive back that we can then pay over to the sewer fund for our debt, if you will. And lastly, and probably the one that is going to cause the most discussion, is Third Street corridor safety improvements. These were funds, we had about $359,000 in FY 2019. We had $580,000 reduced by the amount of engineering and site work for the multimodal bridge. Took that down to around $540,000, $520,000. Then when the multimodal bridge came in way in excess of the project funds that we had accumulated, council directed that a bicycle pedestrian bridge be installed on that location. That drew the funds down to about the $350,000 that I indicated. I'm just using round numbers. During that time, that was installed. During that same time as the multimodal bridge was still being discussed, Third Street corridor safety improvements were proceeding as well. There were some child and bicycle safety grants that were obtained, pedestrian safety grants, which allowed some improvements to be constructed. The raised crosswalk in front of the high school is one of those. Some curb extensions, bulb outs were also part of that. The Hawk signal, pedestrian signal on Mountain View, is a result of some of those grants as well. In addition, in anticipation of the increased vehicular traffic caused by the multimodal bridge, there was also discussion of separated bike lanes, removal of some parking along the Third Street corridor, so on and so forth. Those were discussed. Alta Traffic Engineering was hired to assist in that and provided a recommendation. We had a steering committee or a citizens committee that worked with then Public Works Director Les McDonald on the corridor, and there were several options that were reviewed, but a separated bike lane was one of those things that was considered to be a viable option. At that time, because the council had indicated that they wanted us to continue that discussion, we left the accumulation in the former multimodal bridge line item, changed the name to Third Street Corridor Improvements, and we added $75,000 in fiscal 2020 to bring that number up, because the cost of some of the bike lane, separated bike lane project discussions were somewhere around $380,000. They had not had inflationary factors added into it. The committee, I believe Public Works Finance, was presented a preliminary discussion about that I guess it's been about 5 months ago. Scott Bontrager and Tyler Palmer appeared before the Public Works Finance Committee. So we have, the long and short of it is, we have $434,000 accumulated in that line item. It is our staff's recommendation that because there are some different things going on with 3rd Street. Number one, the multimodal bridge did not go in, that we would ask that we utilize that funding in order to proceed with A Street. That is not a indictment of 3rd Street separated bike lane improvements. That discussion can continue on, and I anticipate it will. This is not, the sole purpose of this recommendation is because we are under a time frame to get A Street done. So, council can see fit to seed that fund for separated bike lanes in the future, just as I anticipate that they will look to reseed or increase the funding for Moser Park street improvements, bring the sidewalk program back to where it was, and keep funding the PMP. I would note that Transportation Commission last week, Bill took the proposal to them, indicated to them these were the challenges on A Street. So it was staff's recommendation that we would seek funding from these funds, and one of the largest accumulations we have, frankly, is the 3rd Street separated bike lanes. And Ann Peterson, who keeps minutes for the Transportation Commission, indicated after listening to the tape, the audio recording, the commission voted unanimously to endorse in principle the proposal for A Street as outlined by staff, with the strong recommendation that the 3rd Street project be reimbursed and prioritized for appropriation in the FY 2021 budget. And certainly, that's Transportation Commission's recommendation. I would indicate to council, as you've heard me say many times, you can certainly determine at this point that is what you would like to do. However, you do not have the power to bind future councils in budgetary matters. So you can certainly, if whichever way you want to proceed, make any comments that you like, but the council that sits at this dais when the FY21 budget is being funded will be the ones making that decision, so regardless of what your direction is tonight. So with that, if council takes staff's recommendation, we would contact LTAC tomorrow. We would be able to transfer funds back into the sewer fund almost immediately, quit racking up that whopping 2.5% interest that the fund is getting, and we'll plan on constructing A Street in the 2020 construction season. With that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Arthur?
I'll jump in first. With all the budgetary shifting about, does this necessitate a reopening of the budget we just passed?
Quite likely. I've not sat down with the finance director and talked about the mechanics yet. Actually, we opened up the budget last year for the current year, since we're right around the end of the budget year. We opened up the budget to allow us to send the 1.264 million down. ITD will be retaining part of that and sending us back the balance. So I don't believe that we do need to open the budget, but whatever the state law says, we will do.
Okay. Part two is mostly a minor rant about the frustration pertaining to this entire project, starting with the ITD's screwing up of the bids last year, and then we're left holding a bag with the inability and ineptitude of the engineers to actually provide a decent bid on what the cost of this actually is. $800,000 is not a minor oopsie when it comes to the difference between the actual bids and what the engineers projected, and I'm dismayed that the engineers cannot adapt themselves to the changing construction climate and actually provide us with accurate or even approaching accurate bid amounts so we aren't taken by surprise like this.
I would note, if I may, in my discussions with Doral Hoff, the ITD district engineer for District 2, he indicates that they are seeing this all over the board, and they are having to abandon projects, accumulate funding for future construction where they can, because they're running into the same thing. Art,
Notwithstanding,
yes.
engineers realize what's going on and don't take us by surprise like this and force us to raid other very worthy projects to pay for a project that is clearly way overdue to be done and has to get done.
As a
And this-
non-engineer, I don't take exception to your rant.
Yeah, and so the other thing is, it does not exactly fill my soul with confidence that we're not going to run into future fiascos with Mountain View between Joseph and Stick Street when that project finally goes out to bid. Unless something changes, I have absolutely zero faith in our colleagues down at LTAC and ITD at the moment. So I would reluctantly be in favor of this thing, but hopefully maybe be able to afford some paint for the Third Street project to at least initiate a hint of what will be a multi-directional bike lane on that street, because we won't be able to afford the rest of it, but some paint would be nice to have there.
I have discussed that with Tyler Palmer and Bill as well. We'll identify what can be done within budgets that we have, and we'll follow council direction. It's just if the funds we'd anticipated for that project will now be going to A Street. So you understand that, but we will take whatever direction you give us.
End of my rant.
I'm not, super happy about taking the money from the Third Street improvement and putting it to this project, but in light of the fact that we don't have a multimodal bridge and increased car traffic on Third Street, we're probably doing more to enhance pedestrian and bicycle safety on a higher traffic street arterial than we would be here. So it's, it's something that needs to be done. Otherwise, we potentially will lose this entire project for another 30 years, and that's not an option I'm willing to consider.
I appreciated, Bill had a chance to talk to me after the Fair and Affordable Housing Commission meeting, but what I really appreciated was how deeply you all have looked to try to find and cobble this together to make it happen, and I know you've done this a lot, and I think because of it, we will get this done, and I'm really pleased with how you were able to figure it out. I know that we'll pay back the funds we need. It just is part of the process, it seems.
Thank you.
I would just add, I think one of the consequences of it not being a multimodal bridge on Third Street is we don't have the urgency of having a significant increase in vehicular traffic there. And fortunately, some of the traffic mitigation measures, as you mentioned, have been put into place, the raised crosswalk and the hawk signal. And I believe the speed limit has been changed throughout the corridor?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yep.
Yes, okay. Thank you. So I feel we got, even though that was all designed to mitigate the effects of the multimodal bridge, which isn't there right now, we still got some of those mitigating factors, despite the fact that we don't have the added traffic. And I think there's a lot of interest in seeing those bike lanes, but the sense of urgency, I think, right now, as compared, as Jim said, to the need there. I mean, this is probably potentially the only chance to get that done on A Street. So I would like to, as Art said, also, look at the next steps for something along there with the bicycles that maybe is not our kind of gold standard that we had been talking about with the 380, I think you said, but maybe an incremental approach, which a lot of communities have been doing with that bike infrastructure, starting with something lower cost, evaluating it. I feel we have a little more time now that we can proceed gradually with that and provide the education that's needed for safety for that type of a system. And we can afford to take a more gradual piecemeal approach, but still have that target and that goal.
Certainly.
I think an unintended positive consequence of this is that now if we're gonna forestall this for another year, it gives us a chance to gather data on traffic across the bike pedestrian bridge and make decisions that are cost-effective, instead of just throwing $380,000 at something that maybe isn't really required with the level of traffic that's coming. So it'll give us a chance to count the traffic on the bridge for a year before we know that, so.
Yeah, I have one question. One of the improvements that had been recommended by the Transportation Commission back when the expectation was the multimodal bridge, was those four-way stops. And that seems to have kind of fallen off the radar. I think that it was Hayes and Blaine, and particularly Hayes seemed to be, I thought, where they were still recommending
Again, not
that.
being an engineer, I recall the discussion quite vividly, though. That four-way stop was intended to help mitigate the increased traffic, I'm just having a tough time today. Increased traffic over the multimodal bridge. Since that traffic is not there, then it would be subject to warrants, things like that. So staff has not proceeded with that recommendation because when we had the discussion, council did not direct that improvement be installed. If you recall, the discussion was to do the hawk signal, do the bulb outs, things like that, but that the stop signs, four-way stop at Hayes and Third Street was not one of the improvements that council directed us to do.
I'd like to follow up on that, because for my recollection, we received that presentation from Les that had all of the suggestions that came out of the planning process, and that was not included, not as something that was or wasn't recommended, it just wasn't a part of the discussion, and nobody caught it. And so that's something I personally would like to see us revisit, if it's something, I had a conversation with Bill about warrants and about what would warrant something like that, a traffic, or a stop sign, whether it be at one or both intersections, and that is something that, I mean, given the level of detail that went into planning for that, we should
Yeah.
discuss.
And I think I do recall asking the Transportation Commission do you still recommend that after the bridge change was made? And at the point I asked, they said, yes, we still do, but so I would like to know what Transportation Commission thinks. I know that even that four-way stop, I believe, on Mountain View near the middle school is one that did not meet that criteria. However, it was still determined that it
That
would
was
go
a
in.
result of direct council authorization. It does not, and it has not and did not meet warrants at the time.
Right.
Council has discretion to have those stop signs installed. There are a couple of stop signs on First Street that are installed that are not warranted as well. However, council has a stop sign policy in that some citizens utilize that stop sign policy in a convincing manner, and council authorized installation of stop signs there. So we have a policy for that. Certainly, if council wants a stop sign, they certainly can direct staff to do that.
I would like to hear from Bill, but I think that could, part of what Jim was talking about, let's get the counts of, if there is a significant increase in the amount of bicycles and pedestrians coming over there, that could be a new factor to bring back to Transportation Commission or who, what do
Yeah,
you?
and certainly those discussions can proceed. It's not pertinent to the decision we're
I know.
making tonight. As I indicated, whatever direction council gives staff is where we'll go. But I didn't want to get too caught up in the Third Street improvements as we're discussing what to do with A Street.
No, we don't need to get too far out in the weeds. We still need to decide whether we're gonna build A Street or not.
Right, I suppose the
Right now.
point more is that it doesn't mean we
Abandoning
can
it.
proceed with this
Right.
redirection of funds and still continue to evaluate what may be
Right.
helpful for safety on the Third Street corridor, but I don't know.
Certainly.
Yeah, I don't see any much choice here. I'm not willing to kick A Street down the road for another 30 years because that intersection and that stretch of road are going to be crucially east-west continuity through town. And I think we need to go ahead with it, no matter how painful it is at the moment, and we're going to just have to backfill the funds that we're taking money out of now and backfill them to get those projects taken care of too. So I recommend and move that we approve the funding program as recommended by staff under the option C to redirect funds to accomplish the A Street corridor improvement.
I second, and then just also wanted to echo Catherine's sentiment as a thank you, commendation to you all. I know it came as a surprise, so excellent work with figuring out what to do and proposing some solutions.
Thank you.
So, yes, second.
Okay, it's been moved by Art and seconded by Ann to approve the funding program recommended by staff, the C option. All those in favor, starting with Catherine?
Well, I'm really glad to get to say hi to this because this was one of the very first meetings that I was a counselor for when we started A Street. So especially with the amount of pedestrians that are over in that part of our city, I'm really thrilled to see that protected. So aye.
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 Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Gary. You're going to be hoarse tomorrow morning. Okay, that's the last item on today's agenda, so we'll move on to reports. Start with Ann.
Sure.
What did you attend this?
I don't have a lot to report. The Transportation Commission met last Thursday, and a big bulk of the discussion was what we talked about tonight with A Street. That was most of it. And then the only other commission was the Pathways Commission, and like all of the commissions, they had to generate their questions. So we'll be seeing all of those come forward for the commission survey. But primarily, they're focused on whether or not people would want to see a bike and ped underpass at I-95, like the one we just constructed, e-bikes and scooters, and lighting on Paradise Path around that section that curves that people talk about not being that well lit. So they want to collect some data on that. And then the Human Rights Commission will meet tomorrow, and the Palouse Space and Aquifer Committee, we have a subcommittee meeting for communications and a regular meeting this week as well. So more updates to come.
Okay, Art?
Yeah, the Arts Commission met and primarily devoted themselves to a postmortem on Art Walk and future modifications, including expansion of open container areas in the downtown to facilitate people walking back and forth, and also developing memoranda of understanding for businesses and artists, covering what the expectations of each are, covering things like insurance, timing, should the artist be present or not, things like that, and also incorporating more of the other arts in the form of theater and dance as well, and getting those incorporated on stages throughout Art Walk, as well as just the graphic painting style of artwork. PKC didn't meet. URA's not meeting this week. It's a bunch of absences. It's like a vacation.
All right. Thank you. Brandy?
Planning and zoning had a busy meeting, finalized their commission questions. Some new things Michael Ray brought forward that will be, that commission will be working on. There was a Supreme Court decision about the sign code, which now the city of Moscow will need to be reviewing sign codes so that regulations that have to be content neutral, there can't be different requirements, which is based on the Supreme Court decision that this type of sign can be this size, but this type of sign can be this size and can be up for this long or that long. So there's going to be an overhaul of that, so I imagine we'll be hearing more of that. Also talking about they will be conducting a hearing on eliminating the requirement that ADUs be on the same electrical service as the primary dwelling. And there were great examples of why that can be problematic, including just the distance between them and the cost with running it. So that's going to be, there will be a hearing coming up on that. Also, discussion about a possibility of eliminating the requirement that is currently in the code that in the R1 zoning district currently requires one covered off-street parking space. And covered is the big adjective here. So the question is, should that be eliminated? It creates, you need more space to create that covered versus just a driveway. And it can affect some of the things that we heard about tonight with really trying to accomplish some smaller R1 homes and lots. It can be challenging to accommodate a covered space. So that's something they're going to be discussing more about.
Thanks. Fair and affordable housing met, and just want to announce that this week is going to be the fair housing training at the 1912 Center Great Room. It's from 8:30 to 3:45. It's intended for realtors, property managers, and landlords, and they seem to have to attend to get a certification, but it is open to the public, so that's important to know. And they did send a mailer out to about 250 multifamily units so they can know about it, and there was a press release too. And then, of course, this commission also worked on their questions for the survey, and the next meeting is October 3rd. And then, if you would like to attend this Sustainable Environment Commission meeting, it's tomorrow night, and we've been meeting at the water building, but that building seems to be having a little relaxed. And so, and so we'll be meeting City Hall at 7:15.
I attended the 1912 facilities meeting the other day, and we had a presentation from Design West Architects about what's going on with the second floor there, and they've decided to do a heat pump system to minimize the ductwork and the long-term energy use there, as well as lighting options that will harvest daylight from outdoor and minimize the amount of cost that's going to go on there, and how they would incorporate everything that's done on the second floor to tie into the third floor so that there will be no additional engineering to make that happen. Also, the stage in the auditorium, instead of installing a lift, they've come up with a way to use the existing elevator to come up another 8 inches or so behind the stage so that you won't have to have a separate lift to get people that are challenged in mobility to get on the stage. So that'll save us a lot of money there. And that's what's going on there. Gary, do you have anything for us?
Just wanted to remind the council that October 2nd in Colfax, we have the quarterly regional breakfast meeting. I believe the topic is maintenance of Whitman County roads. Mark Story, the county engineer, will be talking about that. So just contact Lori if you'd like to go.
One other one is Wednesday is the Chamber of Commerce Candidate Forum at the Best Western at 11:30 to 1 o'clock. For those who are interested in hearing what the slate of 7 candidates have to say for themselves.
There's
Thank you for adding that. Yeah.
6 now.
Yep.
6
by the
cents, we lost one.
Okay, that's all staff has.
Okay, that's everything on our agenda tonight. I entertain a motion to adjourn.
No
Let's
move
go.
we adjourn.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Let's adjourn.